Hey guys, tonight we begin with the divine dysfunction and cosmic corporate drama that is ancient Mesopotamian mythology. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with the Anunnaki, the ancient Sumerian pantheon and perpetual board of directors for a startup called civilization. These weren't just some abstract forces of nature. They were gods, with jobs, with jurisdictions, with seriously complicated family dynamics, and the collective emotional maturity of a particularly dramatic high school reunion. They were, in essence, the original celestial bureaucracy, complete with a reclusive CEO, an angry and overworked COO, and a brilliant but troublemaking head of research and development. Their days were spent managing the cosmos, which mostly involved creating things, getting angry about the things they created, and then trying to destroy the things they created. No sick days, no holidays, and a notable lack of a functioning HR department. They were, in essence, the original creators of humanity, which they designed primarily as a labor force to do all the cosmic chores they were tired of doing themselves. Imagine being so powerful you could shape reality, but you still needed someone else to dig the irrigation ditches. To keep things running smoothly, the gods had a strict hierarchy. Think of them like a divine corporate ladder, but instead of promotions, you got more temples, and instead of getting fired, you got cast into a primordial abyss. At the top was the great triad of gods, the senior executive team. Yes, the same guys who later decided that humanity was getting too noisy and the best solution was a global flood. Workplace drama alert. But it gets weirder. At some point, the gods decided that direct management of mortals was too much of a hassle. Why? Because humanity, in classic fashion, started getting ideas above its station. Ungrateful mortals started making noise, having their own little wars, and generally forgetting who was in charge. So the gods mostly retreated to their celestial palaces, letting kings and priests pick up the slack, sending down the occasional flood or plague just to remind everyone who really held the cosmic pink slip. Ah, Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, where the gods were as unpredictable as the floods, and your best hope for a quiet life was to keep your head down and your sacrifices regular. Let's talk about Anu, or An in Sumerian. The great god of the heavens, the king of the gods, and the divine equivalent of a company's founder who has retired to an advisory role on the board and now spends most of his time on the celestial golf course. If the Mesopotamian pantheon was a cosmic corporation, Anu was the absentee CEO, the ultimate authority who rarely, if ever, actually came into the office. He wasn't some hands-on, lightning-throwing executive like Zeus. Anu was a god of pure, abstract authority. He was the sky itself, the great dome above the world, and his power was based on his position, not his actions. He was the source of all legitimacy. If you wanted to be a king, you needed Anu's approval. If you wanted to be a god, you needed to be a part of his lineage. He held the Anuship, the divine right to rule, and he could grant it or take it away. He was, in essence, the ultimate celestial gatekeeper, the one who decided who got to be in charge. His primary residence was in the highest heaven, a place so remote that most of the other gods needed a formal invitation to visit. He rarely involved himself in the day-to-day squabbles of gods or mortals. While his children and grandchildren were down on earth causing floods, starting wars, and generally making a mess of things, Anu was usually just up there, being the sky, silent, distant, majestic. Think of him as the ultimate remote worker, a being whose authority was so absolute he didn't even need to show up for the meetings. But don't mistake his distance for weakness. When he did get involved, it was a big deal. His decisions were final. He was the ultimate court of appeals. When the other gods had a dispute they couldn't solve, they would travel to his celestial court to have him arbitrate. He was the one who, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, reluctantly agrees to let the goddess Ishtar use the bull of heaven to attack Uruk, an act of divine petulance that he seems to approve of with a cosmic sigh and a shrug. He was less of an active participant in the drama and more of a tired old monarch who just wanted his noisy children to keep it down. He was the father of most of the major gods, including Enlil and Enki, and later, Ishtar. This made him the patriarch of the most dysfunctional family in the ancient world. He presided over a pantheon that was constantly bickering, plotting, and competing for power, all while claiming to derive their authority from him. He was the quiet center of the storm, the still point in a turning world of divine chaos. Moral of the story: true power doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes the best management style is to be completely unreachable. And if you're the king of the gods, you can pretty much let all the important decisions go to voicemail. If Anu was the absentee CEO, then Enlil was the volatile, overworked, and perpetually angry chief operating officer who actually had to run the company. Let's talk about Enlil, god of the wind, the air, the earth, and the guy who really, really did not like being woken up from his nap. Basically, if you've ever felt that you're the only one doing any real work around here, that everyone is making too much noise, and that the only logical solution is total, catastrophic downsizing, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with Mesopotamia's most powerful and ill-tempered deity. Enlil was the son of Anu, but while his father ruled the abstract heavens, Enlil was in charge of the world itself. He was the one who separated the earth from the sky, the one who gave humanity the tools of civilization, like the pickaxe, and the one whose word was the ultimate command that shaped reality. He was powerful, respected, and had the patience of a lit fuse. His city was Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer, and his temple was the Akur, the mountain house from which he issued his decrees. He wasn't a god you prayed to for gentle blessings. He was a god you prayed to out of sheer terror that he might notice you. He was the embodiment of divine authority in its most active and dangerous form. His most famous or infamous moment in mythology was his role in the Great Flood. In the Sumerian flood story, humanity, which had been created to serve the gods, had multiplied and become incredibly noisy. Their clamor and their racket disturbed Enlil's sleep. Imagine being the supreme ruler of the world, and your biggest problem is that your downstairs neighbors are having a party that's lasted for several centuries. Enlil's solution wasn't to file a noise complaint. It was to exterminate the entire human race with a massive flood. No warning, no second chances. Just a decision to wipe the slate clean because he was annoyed. It was the divine equivalent of rage-quitting a project you started. This act paints him as a cruel, capricious tyrant, but from his perspective, it was a matter of cosmic order. The lower-ranking beings were not fulfilling their purpose quietly. They were disrupting the peace of the higher-ranking beings. His decision was brutal, but it was, in his mind, a necessary act of cosmic management. But Enlil wasn't all storms and destruction. He was also a kingmaker. The legitimate rule of a human king in Mesopotamia was dependent on being chosen by Enlil. He was the one who bestowed the scepter and crown, the one whose blessing gave a ruler their authority. So while he was feared, he was also the ultimate source of political stability. He was the great, unpredictable force of nature, the wind that could be a gentle breeze or a destructive hurricane. He was the power of the earth that could be fertile or could swallow you in an earthquake. He was the ultimate boss, the one whose mood swings could literally reshape the world. Moral of the story: never underestimate the wrath of a sleep-deprived manager. Power and a short temper are a dangerous combination. And if you're going to make a lot of noise, make sure the guy in charge isn't a genocidal storm god. If Enlil was the angry, by-the-book COO, then his half-brother Enki, known as Ea in Akkadian, was the brilliant, subversive, and perpetually rule-bending head of the research and development department. Let's talk about Enki, the god of water, knowledge, mischief, and crafts. Basically, if you've ever felt that the rules are more like suggestions, that there's always a clever workaround, and that you have a moral obligation to save humanity from the terrible decisions of upper management, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with Mesopotamia's favorite divine trickster and patron saint of loopholes. Enki was the god of the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean that lay deep beneath the earth. This association with the deep waters was symbolic of his nature. He was a god of profound wisdom, of the deep, hidden knowledge of the universe. He was the master craftsman of the gods, the one who created the blueprints for the cosmos. He was also the god of magic, invention, and all the arts and skills of civilization. If Enlil gave humanity the pickaxe, Enki taught them how to use it, and then probably showed them how to turn it into a musical instrument just for fun. He was, in essence, the ultimate celestial problem solver, the guy you went to when you needed a clever plan, a magical solution, or a really well-designed irrigation system. His defining characteristic was his love for humanity. While the other gods, especially Enlil, saw humans as noisy, disposable laborers, Enki had a soft spot for his creations. He was their protector, their advocate, their divine defense attorney. This often put him in direct conflict with his more short-tempered brother. The most famous example of this is, of course, the Great Flood. While Enlil was determined to wipe out humanity for being too loud, Enki was horrified by the plan. He was bound by an oath to the other gods not to reveal their plan to any mortal directly. So, in a brilliant act of corporate subterfuge, he found a loophole. He went to the reed hut of a wise and pious man named Utnapishtim, or Ziusudra in Sumerian, and spoke to the wall. He whispered the god's secret plan to the reed wall of the hut, knowing full well that Utnapishtim was on the other side, listening. He gave him detailed instructions on how to build a great boat, a giant cube-shaped ark, and to save his family, and a sampling of all the animals. It was a masterful act of plausible deniability. He didn't tell a human. He told a wall. He saved humanity, not through open defiance, but through cleverness and a deep understanding of the letter, if not the spirit, of the law. He was the god who always found a third option, the one who believed that wisdom was more powerful than brute force. He was the playful, inventive, and deeply compassionate god who was always ready to stir the pot to save the world. Moral of the story: knowledge is power, especially when you use it to outsmart your boss. There's always a loophole if you look hard enough. And if you're going to save the world, it helps to have a good lawyer and an even better imagination. Now, let's talk about Inanna, or Ishtar in her Akkadian form, the goddess of love, beauty, sex, war, political power, and being the most fabulously and terrifyingly extra deity in the entire Mesopotamian pantheon. If Enlil was the angry COO and Enki was the clever head of R&D, Inanna was the ambitious, unstoppable, and wildly unpredictable head of sales, marketing, and hostile takeovers. Basically, if you've ever felt simultaneously like the embodiment of divine femininity and a ruthless warlord, and you believe that the best way to get what you want is through a combination of seduction, strategy, and overwhelming force, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with ancient Mesopotamia's ultimate celestial diva and warrior queen. Inanna was a goddess of contradictions. She was the goddess of love, presiding over courtship and sexual passion. Her sacred rites often involved sacred prostitution, a celebration of the life-giving force of sexuality. But she was also a terrifying goddess of war. She was depicted as a heavily armed warrior, standing on the back of a lion, her personal sigil. She didn't just preside over battles, she reveled in them, her presence a sign of the brutal, chaotic joy of conflict. She was, in essence, the living embodiment of the idea that all's fair in love and war, and she was the master of both. Her ambition was boundless. She wasn't content to just be the goddess of her city, Uruk. She wanted more power, more domains, more everything. One of her most famous myths tells of her journey to the Abzu, the watery realm of the wise god Enki. She gets him completely drunk, and in his inebriated state, he gives her the me, the sacred decrees of civilization. These were the fundamental concepts of reality: kingship, justice, wisdom, warfare, artistry. She loaded them all onto her boat of heaven and sailed back to Uruk, a successful act of divine corporate espionage that massively increased her city's power and her own prestige. Her most famous story, however, is her role in the Epic of Gilgamesh. After the hero Gilgamesh spurns her advances, she flies into a narcissistic rage. She goes to her father, Anu, the CEO of the cosmos, and demands that he give her the bull of heaven to unleash upon Uruk. She threatens that if he refuses, she will smash the gates of the underworld and release the dead to eat the living. It was the divine equivalent of a temper tantrum, backed by the threat of a zombie apocalypse. Anu, like any terrified father, relents. Inanna wasn't just a force of nature. She was a force of will. She was passionate, cunning, and utterly ruthless in the pursuit of her goals. She represented the untamable, unpredictable, and awe-inspiring power of female ambition in a world dominated by male gods. Moral of the story: never underestimate a woman with a plan. Hell hath no fury like a goddess scorned. And if you're going to steal the fundamental principles of civilization, make sure you have a fast boat and a high tolerance for alcohol. Now, let's talk about a celestial hostile takeover. While the old Sumerian pantheon was a complex web of family ties and ancient authorities, The rise of Babylon brought a new player to the top of the divine corporate ladder. Let's talk about Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, and the divine equivalent of a young, ambitious executive who engineered a brilliant corporate restructuring that put him in charge of everything. Basically, if you've ever felt that the old way of doing things is inefficient and that you are uniquely qualified to defeat the primordial forces of chaos and be rewarded with supreme universal power, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with Babylon's favorite divine hero and new CEO of the cosmos. In the early days, Marduk was a relatively minor deity. He was the son of Enki, the god of wisdom, which gave him a good pedigree, but he wasn't a major player like Enlil or Anu. His chance to shine came with the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, which is essentially the universe's most dramatic corporate origin story. The story begins with the primordial gods, Apsu, freshwater, and Tiamat, saltwater, whose children, the younger gods, are making too much noise. Apsu wants to kill them, but Enki puts him to sleep and kills him first. This enrages Tiamat, the great, monstrous dragon mother of the cosmos. She declares war on her own descendants, creating an army of 11 terrifying monsters to help her. The younger gods are terrified. They are powerless against the primordial fury of Tiamat. None of them, not even the powerful Anu or the wise Enki, dares to face her. This is where Marduk steps in. He's young, strong, and full of confidence. He goes before the assembly of the gods and makes them an offer. He will face Tiamat and her army, but on one condition. If he is victorious, they must cede all of their authority to him. He must be made the undisputed king of the gods, the supreme ruler of the universe. It was the ultimate high-stakes negotiation. The gods, having no other options, agree. They hold a great banquet, get drunk, and formally grant him supreme power. Marduk then prepares for battle. He arms himself with a bow, a mace, a net, and the 4 winds. He rides his storm chariot to face the great dragon. The ensuing battle is epic. He catches Tiamat in his net, drives the evil wind into her open mouth so she can't close it, and then shoots an arrow that splits her heart. He has defeated chaos. But he doesn't stop there. He takes her massive corpse and, in an act of cosmic creation, he splits it in half like a clamshell. From one half, he creates the sky. From the other, he creates the earth. He then organizes the cosmos, sets the stars in their courses, and establishes the calendar. He creates humanity from the blood of Tiamat's monstrous general, Kingu, to serve the gods. He has not just won a battle, he has created a new, ordered universe from the body of chaos. After his victory, the other gods, true to their word, formally acknowledge his supremacy, giving him 50 names that encompass all of their powers. He has become the undisputed king, the new CEO, his authority earned not by birthright, but by merit. The story of Marduk is a powerful piece of political theology, a myth designed to justify the rise of Babylon as the new center of the Mesopotamian world. Let's descend from the newly ordered world of Marduk and journey to the one realm that remained stubbornly unchanged, the bleak and final kingdom of the underworld. Here, there was no glorious battle or cosmic restructuring. There was only dust, silence, and a terrifying, bitter queen. Let's talk about Ereshkigal, the queen of the great below, the goddess of the underworld, and the divine equivalent of the manager of a branch office so remote and undesirable that no one from corporate ever dares to visit. Basically, if you've ever felt that you are the sole ruler of a vast and important domain, that you get absolutely no respect from the head office, and that your primary management style is one of grim, unyielding bitterness. Congratulations. You've spiritually connected with Mesopotamia's most feared and lonely queen. Ereshkigal was the older sister of the radiant and ambitious Inanna/Ishtar, while her younger sister got the glamorous domains of love and war in the world above. Ereshkigal was given dominion over the underworld, known as Kur or Irkalla. It wasn't a punishment, it was her birthright. She was the absolute authority in the land of no return. Her realm was a grim and dusty city of the dead, surrounded by 7 walls and 7 gates. It was a place of profound sorrow and finality. There was no judgment, no reward, no punishment. Everyone, from the greatest king to the poorest farmer, ended up in the same place, stripped of their identity, clothed in feathers, and eating dust for eternity. Ereshkigal ruled this bleak kingdom with an iron fist. Her word was law, and the laws of the underworld were absolute and unbreakable. The most important law was simple. No one who entered could ever leave. She was the ultimate enforcer of this rule. She was not depicted as a monster, but as a powerful and formidable queen, though one consumed by a deep bitterness born of her isolation and the nature of her realm. Her most famous myth is her confrontation with her own sister, Inanna. When Inanna descends to the underworld, Ereshkigal sees it as a hostile takeover attempt. She is furious. She subjects her sister to the ultimate humiliation, forcing her to strip off a piece of her regalia at each of the 7 gates, until Inanna stands before her naked and powerless. Ereshkigal then kills her with the Eye of Death and hangs her corpse on a hook. It's a brutal, visceral display of her absolute power in her own domain. She is not just a warden. She is the embodiment of the underworld's power to strip away everything that matters in the world of the living. While she is eventually forced by the other gods to give up Inanna's body, she extracts a price, ensuring that the boundary between life and death is respected. She is a tragic and terrifying figure, a queen who rules over a kingdom of dust and sorrow, forever isolated from the world of light. Her heart as cold and unforgiving as the realm she governs. Before there was order, before there were gods with jobs and jurisdictions, there was chaos. And in Mesopotamia, chaos was a woman, a dragon, a mother. Let's talk about Tiamat, the primordial goddess of the saltwater ocean, the great mother of everything, and the divine equivalent of a company's co-founder who was brutally forced out and then came back for a truly monstrous, wrongful termination lawsuit. Basically, if you've ever felt that you brought everyone into this world and you can sure as heck take them out of it, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the universe's most terrifying and creative matriarch. In the beginning, there was only Tiamat, the swirling, chaotic saltwater sea, and her consort, Apsu, the freshwater abyss. From their mingling, the first generation of gods was born. These younger gods were a noisy, boisterous bunch, their energy and clamor disturbing the primordial stillness of their parents. Apsu, the father, couldn't take the noise anymore and decided on a simple solution: kill them all. Tiamat, at this point, was actually the more reasonable of the two. She was furious at the idea of destroying their own children. But the clever god Enki moved first, killing Apsu. This is where Tiamat's character takes a sharp turn. The grief and rage over the death of her husband transformed her from a protective mother into a monstrous agent of vengeance. The quiet, chaotic sea began to boil. She decided that if her children had killed their father, she would unmake them all. She became the ultimate dragon of chaos. She didn't just declare war, she birthed a new army for it. She created 11 horrifying monsters, the first of their kind. Giant serpents with venom for blood, raging dragons, sphinxes, giant lions, mad dogs, and scorpion men. She was not just a force of destruction, she was a force of terrifying creation, spawning nightmares to destroy her own offspring. She elevated one of her children, Kingu, to be her new consort and the general of her monstrous army. She gave him the Tablet of Destinies, the divine artifact that controlled the universe, making him the supreme authority. She was ready to undo creation, to pull the entire cosmos back into her own chaotic, watery womb. The younger gods were paralyzed with fear. Tiamat was not just an enemy. She was their mother. She was their source. To fight her was to fight the very nature of their own existence. This is why none of them, not even the wisest, dared to face her. Her power was primordial, absolute, and deeply personal. It took an outsider, a new generation of God, Marduk, to finally challenge her. His battle with her wasn't just a fight. It was the establishment of a new world order, a patriarchal system conquering a matriarchal chaos. Tiamat's body, the body that had birthed the gods, was then used as the raw material to build their new, ordered world. She was the monstrous mother, whose death was the necessary sacrifice for the birth of civilization. Let's take a quick tour of the Mesopotamian underworld, a place known as Kur, or Irkalla. If you were hoping for a complex system of rewards and punishments, or a scenic paradise for the virtuous, you've come to the wrong afterlife. The Mesopotamian underworld was, in essence, a divine DMV, depressing, bureaucratic, and a place everyone ends up eventually with no hope of a pleasant experience. Basically, if you've ever felt that regardless of how you live your life, the ultimate outcome is a dusty, boring, and irreversible state of being, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the profound pessimism of the Mesopotamian view of death. Kur was envisioned as a great, dark city surrounded by 7 walls and 7 gates. It was a vast, subterranean realm located deep beneath the earth, a land of no return. And they were very, very serious about that last part. The journey there began with the spirit, the Gidim, being led to the river that separated the worlds, where it had to cross with the help of a ferryman, a concept that would later be echoed in Greek mythology. Once across, the soul would be brought to the gates of the great city. At each of the 7 gates, the soul was required to strip off one item of clothing or adornment. By the time it reached the center, it was naked, a symbol of being stripped of its earthly status and identity. In the underworld, you weren't a king or a priest or a farmer. You were just dead. The ruler of this bleak domain was the formidable Queen Ereshkigal. She didn't preside over a court of judgment. There was no weighing of hearts, no negative confessions. Your deeds in life had absolutely no bearing on your treatment in death. Everyone, the good, the bad, the hero, the villain, got the exact same deal. And the deal was terrible. The underworld was the house of dust. The shades of the dead were said to be clothed in feathers, like birds, and their only sustenance was dust and clay. It was an eternity spent in darkness, thirst, and a state of miserable, semi-conscious boredom. The best you could hope for was that your living relatives would continue to make offerings of food and water at your grave. These offerings would provide some small comfort to your thirsty spirit. This is why having children to perform these rites was so incredibly important. If you were forgotten by the living, your existence in Kür would be even more miserable. This vision of the afterlife is profoundly bleak. It reflects a worldview where life, with all its struggles and its fleeting joys, was incredibly precious, because the alternative was so horrifyingly grim. There was no hope of a better world to come. The goal was not to die a good death to get into heaven, but to live a long life and be remembered, to hold off the inevitable descent into the dusty, silent darkness for as long as possible. The city of Uruk was a jewel, its walls baked by the Mesopotamian sun, rising from the plains like a fortress of civilization. But within these walls, a shadow loomed. Its king was Gilgamesh. He was not a man, not in the way others were. He was 2/3 God and 1/3 mortal, a creation of the deities themselves. His body was a masterpiece of divine engineering, endowed with a strength and beauty that surpassed all others. But his heart was a tyrant's. He was a king of boundless energy and no compassion. He ruled Uruk with a fist of iron and arrogance. He strode through the city as if it were his personal property, his desires the only law. He took what he wanted when he wanted it. No man's son was safe from his endless backbreaking labor projects, building and rebuilding the great walls of his city. No man's daughter, no bride on her wedding night, was safe from his lust. He was the embodiment of the droit du Seigneur, the right of the Lord, and he exercised it without shame or restraint. The people of Uruk groaned under his oppression. Their sons were exhausted. Their daughters were defiled. Their joy had turned to sorrow. In their desperation, they cried out to the gods. They prayed not for Gilgamesh's destruction, but for a solution, for something or someone to temper the king's wild heart. The gods heard their pleas. The great god Anu listened to the cries of the people and called upon the goddess of creation, Aruru. He gave her a task: create a double for Gilgamesh, a second self, an equal in strength and spirit. Create a man wild enough to challenge the king's untamed heart. Let them contend with each other, so that Uruk may have peace. So Aruru, the mother goddess, went to the wilderness. She washed her hands, took a pinch of clay, and cast it upon the steppe. And there, in the wild lands beyond the city walls, she fashioned a man. He was Enkidu. He was not born of woman, but of the earth itself. He was as wild as the clay from which he was made. His body was covered in matted hair, his locks as long as a woman's, growing as freely as the grain. He knew nothing of civilization, of cities, of men. He was a creature of nature. He lived with the animals, running with the gazelles, drinking from their water holes, his heart filled with the simple joy of the wild. He was the perfect mirror to Gilgamesh. Where Gilgamesh was the pinnacle of civilization, Enkidu was the embodiment of the natural world. Where Gilgamesh was a king who oppressed his people, Enkidu was a guardian who protected the beasts of the wild. He would fill in the pits dug by trappers and tear up their snares. He was the wild, untamed force that was destined to meet the civilized, tyrannical force of Uruk. The stage was set. The gods had created their answer: a wild man from the steppe, a soulmate and a rival, the one being in all creation who could meet the terrible king as an equal. The creation of Enkidu did not go unnoticed. A trapper, his livelihood threatened by this wild man who kept freeing the animals from his snares, saw the creature from the steppe. He was terrified by Enkidu's raw strength and his communion with the beasts. The trapper went to his father, who gave him a piece of cunning advice. He told him to go to Uruk, to the great king Gilgamesh, and to ask him for a shamhat, a temple prostitute, a woman whose sacred duty was the art of love. The father's plan was a masterpiece of civilizing strategy. Let the woman tame the wild man, not with force, but with the power of seduction. The trapper did as he was told. He journeyed to Uruk and stood before Gilgamesh, telling him of the wild man who roamed the steppe and thwarted his work. Gilgamesh, his interest piqued, agreed to the plan. He gave the trapper the beautiful shamhat and told them to return to the wilderness. He instructed them to wait by the waterhole. When Enkidu came to drink with the animals, Shamhat was to reveal her beauty and offer herself to him. For 6 days and 7 nights, Enkidu and Shamhat lay together. In this act, something profound happened. It was not just a physical union. It was a transfer of knowledge, of culture, of humanity itself. When the week was over, Enkidu rose to return to his herd, to the gazelles who were his family. But when they saw him, they shied away. They fled from him. He had lost his wildness, his pure connection to the natural world. He tried to run with them, but his knees failed him. He was weaker, but his mind was stronger. He now had wisdom and understanding. He had been awakened. He returned to Shamhat, who began to teach him the ways of civilization. She told him of Uruk, of its great walls and its powerful king, Gilgamesh, a man of strength like his own. And as she spoke of the king's arrogance, of his tyranny, a new feeling sparked in Enkidu's heart, a sense of purpose. He decided he would go to Uruk. He would challenge this king. Shamhat then clothed him, sharing her own garments with him, and began to lead him on the path towards humanity. Their first stop was a shepherd's camp. Here, Enkidu was introduced to the food of mortals. He was offered bread and beer. He had only ever known milk from wild animals, and he squinted at these strange new things. But he ate the bread until he was full, and he drank 7 goblets of the beer. His heart expanded with a joy he had never known. He washed his matted body, anointed himself with oil, and put on clothes. He had become a man. He took up a weapon and began to guard the shepherds, protecting their flocks from lions and wolves. The wild protector of the wild beasts had become the civilized protector of the domesticated ones. He had been tamed, but his wild strength remained, now tempered with human consciousness, and it was all aimed at one goal: to find the great king Gilgamesh in his mighty city and to challenge the tyranny he had heard so much about. While Enkidu was being initiated into the world of men, Gilgamesh in Uruk was being prepared for his arrival by the gods. He had 2 strange and powerful dreams. In the first, a meteor fell from the heavens, so heavy that Gilgamesh could not lift it. He was drawn to it, embracing it like a wife. In the second dream, an axe appeared in the streets of Uruk, and he was similarly drawn to its strange beauty. He took both dreams to his mother, the wise goddess Ninsun. She interpreted them for him. The meteor and the axe, she explained, were his companion, his second self. A man of incredible strength, born on the steppe, was coming. She foretold that Gilgamesh would love him as a wife, and that this companion would become his savior and his most loyal friend. Gilgamesh was comforted by her words, his heart strangely eager to meet this man who would be his equal. Enkidu and Shamhat finally arrived at the gates of Uruk. The people of the city gathered around the wild man, marveling at his strength and his rugged appearance. They saw in him a mirror of their own king, a perfect match. "He is like Gilgamesh in stature," they whispered, "but shorter. He is stronger in bone." The stage was set for the inevitable confrontation. The moment of their meeting came as Gilgamesh was on his way to another act of tyranny. He was heading to a wedding chamber to claim his right to sleep with the bride before her husband. But at the doorway, his path was blocked. Enkidu stood there, his feet planted firmly in the entrance, his powerful body a living barrier to the king's arrogance. Gilgamesh, the tyrant who had never been challenged, was stopped. A furious primal rage filled him. The two men, the two halves of a single soul, grappled in the street. It was a battle of titans. They crashed into the doorpost, shaking the very walls of the city. They were like two great bulls, locked in a struggle of pure strength. The people of Uruk watched in awe as the wild man from the steppe met their king, not with fear, but with an equal and unyielding force. For the first time in his life, Gilgamesh had met his match. The battle was fierce, but in the end, Gilgamesh, with his 2/3 divine strength, managed to throw Enkidu. But something shifted in that moment of victory. As Gilgamesh stood over his defeated rival, his rage subsided, replaced by a profound sense of respect and recognition. He saw in Enkidu not an enemy, but the brother his mother had promised, the friend his soul had been longing for. The fight was over. Gilgamesh turned away, his anger cooled, and Enkidu, seeing the change in the king, spoke to him, acknowledging his superior strength and his divine right to rule. In that moment of mutual respect, their enmity dissolved, and the foundation of the greatest friendship in all of literature was laid. They embraced, they kissed, they had contended with each other, and in doing so, they had found each other. The prophecy was fulfilled. The wild heart of Gilgamesh had been met, and in the process had been calmed. Uruk finally had a chance for peace. The city of Uruk settled into a period of calm. Gilgamesh, his wild energy now channeled by his friendship with Enkidu, ceased his tyrannical ways. But the king's boundless spirit could not be content with peace for long. He was a hero, and a hero needs a quest, a great deed to perform that will ensure his name is remembered for all time. He was haunted by the knowledge of his own mortality. As a man, 1/3 of him was destined to die, and he was terrified of a quiet, meaningless end. He needed to do something so great that his fame would be eternal, a form of immortality to substitute for the real thing. One day, he went to Enkidu, his face set with a new, dangerous purpose. He announced his plan. He wanted to journey to the great cedar forest, a distant, sacred, and terrifying place, and there he would face and kill its guardian, the monstrous demigod, Humbaba. This was an act of supreme audacity. The cedar forest was a divine realm, the home of the gods, and Humbaba had been appointed as its guardian by the great god Enlil himself. Humbaba was a creature of pure terror. His roar was a flood, his mouth was fire, and his breath was death. To challenge him was to challenge the authority of Enlil, to trespass on sacred ground, and to face a monster that no mortal had ever defeated. Enkidu, who had known the wilderness and had heard tales of Humbaba, was horrified. He tried to dissuade his friend. He described the monster's terrifying power, the vastness of the forest, the sheer impossibility of the task. "Why do you wish to do this thing?" he pleaded. But Gilgamesh was resolute. He was driven by a deep fear of oblivion. He told Enkidu that he would rather die a glorious death in battle than live a long life and be forgotten. He spoke of fame, of making a name for himself that would endure forever. His words, a mixture of courage and arrogance, eventually swayed his friend. Enkidu, bound by his love and loyalty, agreed to accompany him, though his heart was filled with a dark foreboding. They went to the elders of Uruk to announce their plan and ask for their blessing. The elders, like Enkidu, were terrified. They too warned Gilgamesh of the danger, of the folly of challenging Humbaba. But seeing that their king's mind was made up, they gave their reluctant blessing. They entrusted their king's safety to Enkidu, urging the wild man to protect Gilgamesh and to let him lead the way into battle. The two friends then went to the temple to make offerings to the sun god, Shamash, the god of justice and a protector of travelers. Gilgamesh's mother, the goddess Ninsun, also prayed to Shamash, her heart breaking with fear for her son. She formally adopted Enkidu as her own son, placing a sacred pendant around his neck and entrusting him with Gilgamesh's life. The decision was made. The preparations were complete. The two heroes, armed with great axes and swords forged for the occasion, stood ready at the gates of Uruk, about to embark on a journey into the heart of a sacred forest, to steal its treasure and kill its immortal guardian. The journey to the cedar forest was an epic trek, a journey of 50 leagues that would take a normal man 3 months. But the two heroes, with their divine strength, covered the distance in just 6 days. They walked from sunrise to sunset, their great strides eating up the miles. Each night as they made camp, Gilgamesh would perform a ritual. He would dig a well, make an offering of flour to the mountain, and then fall into a deep, troubled sleep. And each night, he would have a terrible dream, a dark and violent omen. The first dream was of a mountain collapsing, trapping him by the feet. The second was of a great, wild bull that gored him and pinned him to the ground. The third was of a terrifying thunderstorm that rained darkness and fire. Each time, Gilgamesh would awake in a state of terror, convinced the dream was a sign of impending doom. But each time, Enkidu, with his wisdom of the wild and his deep loyalty, would reinterpret the dream for his friend. The collapsing mountain, he would say, was not a threat, but a symbol of Humbaba, whom they would capture. The wild bull was not an enemy, but the sun god Shamash, who would protect them. The storm was a sign of the god's power working in their favor. Enkidu's interpretations, whether they were true or just born of a desperate need to keep his friend's courage from failing, worked. Gilgamesh, reassured by his companion, would press on. Finally, they reached the edge of the great forest. They stood in awe at the sight. It was a place of sublime and terrifying beauty, a vast green cathedral of cedars that towered into the sky. The scent of cedar resin filled the air, a sacred perfume. The silence was deep and ancient, broken only by the chirping of insects and the distant cry of a strange bird. They had reached the home of the gods, and they were trespassing. As they stood at the gate of the forest, a profound fear seized Gilgamesh. His face grew pale, his hands trembled. The reality of what he was about to do, the sheer sacrilege of it, hit him with its full force. He felt his courage drain away, replaced by a paralyzing dread. But now, it was Enkidu's turn to be the strong one. Seeing his friend's fear, Enkidu's own forebodings vanished, replaced by a fierce loyalty. He reminded Gilgamesh of his own words, of his desire for eternal fame. He urged him not to turn back, to remember the promises he had made. Two men, friends, can overcome any danger, he said. His words, filled with courage and love, rekindled the fire in Gilgamesh's heart. Together, they opened the gate and stepped into the sacred gloom of the cedar forest. They began to cut down the great trees with their bronze axes, their actions a deliberate desecration of the sacred grove. The sound of their chopping echoed through the silent forest, a challenge to its guardian. And from deep within the woods, a terrible voice roared in answer. It was Humbaba. He was coming. The final confrontation was at hand. From the heart of the forest, the monster Humbaba emerged, and he was more terrible than any tale had described. His face was a grotesque mask of coiled intestines. His eyes glared with a terrifying power, and his breath was a fire that consumed the trees. He was the embodiment of the wild, sacred fury of nature, and he was enraged by the intrusion of the two heroes. He fixed Gilgamesh with his gaze, and a weakness, a magical aura of fear, washed over the king. Gilgamesh felt his strength fail him. He was paralyzed. But just as Humbaba was about to strike, the sun god Shamash, hearing Gilgamesh's desperate prayers, intervened from the heavens. He unleashed 13 great winds against the monster: the north wind, the south wind, the east wind, the west wind, the whirlwind, the tempest, the freezing wind, the scorching wind. They swirled around Humbaba, blinding him, buffeting him, and trapping him so that he could not move forwards or backwards. The monster was immobilized. Seeing his chance, Gilgamesh's courage returned. He and Enkidu charged. They cornered the great beast, and Humbaba, seeing he was defeated, began to plead for his life. He flattered Gilgamesh, calling him a great king and promising to be his servant. He offered to cut down the sacred cedars for him, to build him a great palace. Gilgamesh, for a moment, was moved by his pleas. He felt a flicker of pity for the trapped monster and considered sparing him. But Enkidu was ruthless. He warned Gilgamesh not to trust the creature. "Do not listen to him," he urged. "He is a monster, and he will betray you. You must kill him to secure your fame." Humbaba, hearing Enkidu's words, turned his fury on him, cursing him, vowing that he would not live a long life. But the decision was made. Together, the two friends attacked. Gilgamesh struck the monster's neck with his great axe. Enkidu followed with his sword. With the third blow, Humbaba fell. The great guardian of the cedar forest was dead. His death was a cosmic event. The mountains and the hills trembled. The forest, which had been so vibrant, fell into a dark, silent stillness. They had killed the spirit of the forest itself. They had triumphed. They cut down the tallest of the cedars, a tree so massive it could serve as the gate for a great temple. They fashioned a raft, and with the great tree and the monstrous head of Humbaba as their trophy, they sailed down the Euphrates River, back towards Uruk. They had faced the impossible and won. They had stolen the sacred treasure of the gods and killed its guardian. Gilgamesh had achieved the eternal fame he so desperately craved. But their great victory had been an act of sacrilege, a defiance of the divine order. They had killed a servant of Enlil, and in their moment of greatest triumph, they had planted the seeds of a terrible tragedy that was to come. The return of Gilgamesh and Enkidu to Uruk was a moment of supreme triumph. They floated down the Euphrates on their raft with the grotesque head of Humbaba as proof of their incredible deed. The people of Uruk poured out of the city to greet them, cheering their glorious king and his mighty companion. Gilgamesh washed the filth of his long journey from his body, anointed himself with oil, and donned his royal robes. He was at the peak of his power and his beauty, a king who had challenged a god and won. His glory was so radiant that it caught the eye of a goddess. Inanna, or Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, the patroness of Uruk itself, saw the beautiful king and was overcome with desire. She appeared before him in all her divine splendor and made him an offer. She proposed marriage. She promised him a chariot of lapis lazuli and gold, a house of fragrant cedar, and dominion over all other kings. It was a proposal of immense power and honor, an invitation to become the consort of the most powerful goddess in the pantheon. But Gilgamesh, his heart still filled with the arrogance of his victory, refused her, and he did not refuse her gently. He scorned her. He insulted her. He threw her past love affairs in her face, listing all the mortal lovers she had taken and then discarded or destroyed. He reminded her of the shepherd she had turned into a wolf, of the gardener she had turned into a mole. He called her a faulty door that lets in the wind, a shoe that bites the owner's foot. He rejected her utterly, publicly, and cruelly. Ishtar was humiliated. Her divine pride was wounded, and her desire turned to a burning, murderous rage. She flew up to the heavens, to the court of her father, Anu, the king of the gods. She wept and raged, demanding vengeance. She told her father what Gilgamesh had said to her, how he had shamed her. And then she made her terrible demand. She wanted Anu to give her the bull of heaven, a monstrous, celestial beast, so she could unleash it upon Uruk and destroy Gilgamesh. Anu was hesitant. He warned her that the bull of heaven would cause 7 years of famine in the land. But Ishtar was implacable. She assured him she had stored enough grain to feed the people. And then she gave her ultimatum. If he did not give her the bull, she would smash the gates of the underworld, break down its bolts, and release the hordes of the dead to swarm the earth and devour the living. It was the ultimate threat, a promise of a zombie apocalypse. Anu, terrified by his daughter's rage, had no choice but to relent. He placed the leash of the bull of heaven in her hand. Ishtar, her heart filled with a cruel, triumphant vengeance, led the great beast down from the heavens towards the city of Uruk, ready to unleash a plague of destruction upon the king who had dared to scorn her love. The bull of heaven descended upon the city of Uruk, and it was a catastrophe. With its first snort, a great chasm opened in the earth, and 100 young men of Uruk fell in and died. With its second snort, another pit opened, and 200 more men were swallowed by the earth. It was a plague of divine proportions, a monster of pure destruction let loose upon the city. But Uruk was not defenseless. It had its 2 great heroes. Enkidu, seeing the destruction, was the first to act. He leaped upon the great beast, seizing it by its horns. The bull thrashed wildly, spewing its slobber in his face and goring him with its great horns. But Enkidu held on, his wild strength a match for the celestial monster. He called out to Gilgamesh for help. "My friend," he cried, "we have boasted that we are strong. Now we must prove it." Gilgamesh, his courage restored by his friend's bravery, moved with the speed and grace of a master bullfighter. While Enkidu held the monster's head, Gilgamesh danced around its deadly horns and plunged his great sword deep into the back of its neck, right between the vertebrae. The bull of heaven shuddered and collapsed, dead. The two friends had done the impossible once again. They had defeated the instrument of a god's vengeance. They tore out the monster's heart and offered it as a sacrifice to the sun god, Shamash. But their victory was immediately followed by an act of profound disrespect. Enkidu, still filled with the fury of the battle, tore off one of the bull's thighs and threw it in the face of the goddess Ishtar, who was watching from the city walls. "If I could lay my hands on you," he shouted at her, "I would do to you what I have done to this beast." It was a final, terrible insult, a moment of hubris that would seal his fate. Ishtar gathered the temple prostitutes and courtesans, and together they set up a great lament for the thigh of the bull of heaven. But the rest of the city celebrated. Gilgamesh had the bull's magnificent, lapis lazuli-tipped horns mounted in his palace as a trophy. That night, there was a great feast in Uruk to celebrate the victory. But that night, Enkidu had a terrible dream. He saw the great gods, Anu, Enlil, and Shamash, gathered in council. They were debating the fate of the two heroes. They had killed Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest. They had cut down the sacred trees. And now, they had killed the bull of heaven. These were crimes against the divine order, and someone had to pay the price. Anu and Enlil were furious. Enlil decreed that one of them must die. Shamash, their protector, argued for them, but he was overruled. And Enlil, in his final judgment, decided that it would not be the two-thirds divine king who would die. It would be the man from the steppe, the one who was made of clay. Enkidu had been condemned. Enkidu awoke from his dream in a cold sweat. He told Gilgamesh what he had seen, the verdict of the gods. A great sorrow and a bitter anger filled him. He looked at the great cedar gate he had brought back from the forest and cursed it. He cursed the trapper who had first found him. He cursed the harlot Shamhat who had tamed him and brought him to civilization. He lamented that he was being denied a warrior's death in battle and was instead to be taken by a common sickness. But the sun, God Shamash, spoke to him from the heavens, reminding him of the joys that civilization had brought him, his friendship with Gilgamesh, the fine food and drink, the royal clothes. Enkidu's heart was softened, and he retracted his curses. He then fell ill. For 12 days he lay on his sickbed, his great strength wasting away. Gilgamesh sat by his side, weeping, refusing to leave him. Enkidu, in his fever, had another dream, a terrifying vision of the underworld. He saw the house of dust, the land of no return. He described the grim, dark place where the dead, clothed in feathers, ate clay and were ruled by the fearsome queen Ereshkigal. It was a bleak, hopeless vision, the fate that awaited him. On the 12th day, his suffering ended. He died. The grief that fell upon Gilgamesh was not the sorrow of a king for a subject or a man for a friend. It was the tearing apart of a single soul. He was utterly, completely shattered. He let out a roar of anguish like a lioness robbed of her cubs. He tore at his hair and his royal clothes, covering himself in dust. He refused to believe Enkidu was dead. He sat by the body for 6 days and 7 nights, watching, waiting for a sign of life, until a maggot fell from his friend's nostril. Only then did he accept the final, terrible reality. He held a magnificent state funeral for his friend. He had a great statue of Enkidu, made of gold and precious stones. He made offerings to the gods of the underworld, trying to ensure his friend's comfort in the house of dust. But nothing could fill the void that Enkidu's death had left. The loss was absolute. But Enkidu's death did more than just break Gilgamesh's heart. It awoke in him a new and all-consuming terror. For the first time, the king who was 2/3 God was forced to confront the 1/3 of him that was mortal. He looked at his dead friend, and he saw his own future. He was terrified of death, the fear of oblivion, of ending up in the same bleak, dusty underworld that Enkidu had described, became an obsession. His grief transformed into a frantic, desperate quest. He would not accept this fate. He decided he would do what no mortal had ever done before. He would find the secret of eternal life. He would find the one man who had survived the great flood, Utnapishtim, who had been granted immortality by the gods. He would journey to the ends of the earth, face any danger, to learn from him how to conquer death. His first great quest had been for fame. His new quest was for life itself. He abandoned his city, his duties, his kingship. He clothed himself in the rough skins of a lion and set off alone into the wilderness. A king turned wanderer, driven by the greatest fear of all. Gilgamesh's journey in search of Utnapishtim was a descent into the unknown, a journey to the very edge of the world. He traveled through the wild lands, his grief and fear his only companions. His quest led him to the great mountain pass of Mashu, whose twin peaks reached to the heavens and whose foundations reached down into the underworld. This pass guarded the path of the sun. The entrance to the pass was guarded by 2 terrifying creatures, a scorpion man and his wife. Their glory was awesome, and their glance was death. They were hybrid beings, part human, part scorpion, their very presence a test for any who dared to approach. When they saw Gilgamesh, they were struck by the fact that he was 2/3 divine. The scorpion man challenged him, asking the purpose of his desperate journey. Gilgamesh, his voice filled with sorrow, told him of the death of his friend Enkidu and of his own overwhelming fear of death. He explained that he was seeking his ancestor, Utnapishtim, to learn the secret of life and death. The scorpion man was moved by his grief, but he warned him that the path ahead was one of impossible difficulty. The pass through the Mashu Mountains was the very tunnel that the sun traveled through each night. It was a journey of 12 leagues of absolute, crushing darkness. No mortal had ever attempted it. But seeing the determination in Gilgamesh's eyes, he granted him passage. Gilgamesh entered the tunnel. The darkness was immediate and absolute. It was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blackness that could not be pierced. He walked for league after league, unable to see what was ahead of him or behind him. The silence was as profound as the darkness. It was a journey through the pure void, a trial of pure endurance and will. He walked, his mind filled with the image of his dead friend and the terror of his own mortality. As he neared the end of the 12 leagues, he began to feel a wind on his face. He saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. He quickened his pace, stumbling and running towards the light. He emerged from the tunnel just as the sun was about to enter it, for its nightly journey. He had made it through. He found himself in a place of surreal and dazzling beauty. It was a garden of the gods. The trees bore not fruit, but precious stones. The leaves were of lapis lazuli, and the branches were heavy with clusters of carnelian and other gems. It was a place of divine, sterile beauty, a paradise at the edge of the world. He wandered through this magical garden until he came to the shore of a great sea. And there, by the edge of the water, he saw a tavern. And in the tavern sat a woman, the tavern keeper, a wise and ancient goddess named Siduri. Siduri, the divine tavern keeper, saw the wild-looking man approaching from the garden of gems. He was clothed in animal skins, his face gaunt from his travels, his body emaciated, but still radiating a powerful, desperate energy. Fearing he was a murderer or some other dangerous wanderer, she barred the door of her tavern. But Gilgamesh called out to her, telling her his name and his story. He spoke of his grief for Enkidu and his terror of death. My friend, whom I loved so dearly, who went through all hardships with me, Enkidu, whom I loved so dearly, has now gone to the fate of mankind. Because of him, I roam the steppe. My heart is heavy. How can I be silent? How can I be still? My friend, whom I loved, has turned to clay. He asked her for the way to Utnapishtim. Siduri, her heart moved by his raw human sorrow, opened her door. She offered him not a path to immortality, but a piece of profound, gentle wisdom. She told him that his quest was futile. Gilgamesh, where are you hurrying to? She asked. You will never find that life that you are looking for. When the gods created man, they allotted to him death, but life they retained in their own keeping. She urged him to abandon his impossible quest. Instead, she advised him to accept his mortal fate and to find joy in the life that he had. As for you, Gilgamesh, she said, fill your belly with good things, day and night, night and day. Dance and be merry, feast and rejoice. Let your clothes be fresh, bathe yourself in water, cherish the little child that holds your hand, and make your wife happy in your embrace. For this too is the lot of man. It was a beautiful, simple, and powerful argument for finding meaning and happiness in the ordinary, transient pleasures of human life. It was a call to embrace mortality, not to fight it. But Gilgamesh could not hear it. His grief and fear were too great. He was obsessed. Seeing that he would not be dissuaded, Siduri gave him the information he sought, but with another warning. The only way to reach Utnapishtim was to cross the waters of death, an ocean so deadly that its touch meant instant oblivion. No mortal had ever crossed it. The only one who could was a man named Urshanabi, the ferryman of Utnapishtim. He lived in the woods nearby. She warned Gilgamesh to be careful, but the king, in his haste and frustration, did not listen. He rushed into the woods and found Urshanabi with the stone things, mysterious objects that allowed the boat to cross the deadly waters safely. In a blind, foolish rage, Gilgamesh took his axe and smashed the stone things to pieces. He had just destroyed the one thing that could have guaranteed his safe passage. He had, once again, let his untamed heart lead him to a self-destructive act. Urshanabi, the ferryman, was stunned by Gilgamesh's act of mindless destruction. "Why did you do this?" he asked. "You have destroyed the very things that would have taken us across the sea." Gilgamesh, his rage spent, was now faced with the consequences of his actions. He had made his impossible journey even more difficult. But Urshanabi, seeing the king's profound despair, offered a solution. He instructed Gilgamesh to go back into the forest and cut down 120 poles, each 60 cubits long. These poles would be their only means of crossing the waters of death. They would use them as punting poles, and each time a pole touched the deadly water, it would be instantly corroded and have to be discarded. This would allow them to propel the boat without ever touching the water themselves. It was a laborious and inefficient solution, necessitated by the king's own folly. Together, they launched the ferryboat and began their journey. It was a strange and silent crossing. For each push of the pole, Gilgamesh would have to discard it and take a new one. 120 times, he pushed them across the still, black, and utterly lethal waters. When the last pole was gone, they were still not at the shore. Gilgamesh then took off his animal skins and held them up to fashion a makeshift sail. Finally, after a long and arduous journey, they reached the distant shore. There, on the beach, stood an old man, watching them approach. It was Utnapishtim, the faraway, the one mortal who had escaped death. Gilgamesh, exhausted and ragged, disembarked and stood before the immortal man. He poured out his story once again, the tale of his friendship with Enkidu, his grief, and his all-consuming fear of death. He looked at Utnapishtim, expecting to see a godlike hero, a figure of immense power. But what he saw was just a man, old and weathered by time, no different in appearance from himself. "How is it," Gilgamesh asked, "that you, a mortal man, have been granted eternal life and a place among the gods?" And so Utnapishtim, the survivor of the great flood, began to tell his own story. He revealed that his immortality was not something he had earned through heroic deeds, but was a unique gift from the gods, a consequence of a terrible event that had almost wiped humanity from the face of the earth. He began to tell Gilgamesh the secret of the gods, the story of the great flood. It was a story not of heroism, but of survival, of divine caprice, and of the profound, unbridgeable gap between gods and men. Gilgamesh, who had come seeking the secret of how to live forever, was about to learn why he was destined to die. Utnapishtim's story began in the ancient city of Shuruppak, on the banks of the Euphrates. It was a time when the world was teeming with life, and the human population had grown vast. And they were noisy. The clamor of humanity rose to the heavens and greatly disturbed the sleep of the great god Enlil. His solution, as it had been before, was simple and brutal: annihilation. He convinced the council of the gods to send a great flood to destroy every living thing on earth. The gods swore an oath of secrecy, vowing not to reveal the impending doom to any mortal. But the wise god Enki, the creator and protector of mankind, was deeply troubled. He was bound by the oath, but he could not stand by and watch his creation be destroyed. So he resorted to his usual trickery. He went to the reed house of Utnapishtim, a man known for his piety and wisdom. Enki did not speak to Utnapishtim directly. Instead, he spoke to the wall of the hut. "Reed hut, reed hut, wall, wall," he whispered. "Listen, reed hut, and pay attention. Wall, man of Shuruppak, son of Ubaratutu, tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon your possessions and seek life. Spurn property and save your soul." He told the wall to build a great ark, giving it precise and peculiar dimensions. The boat was to be a perfect cube, its length, width, and height all equal. It was to have 7 decks, each divided into 9 compartments. It was to be sealed inside and out with bitumen to make it waterproof. Utnapishtim, on the other side of the wall, heard everything. He understood the god's cryptic message. He was terrified, but he agreed to do as the god had commanded. He went to the elders of his city and lied, telling them that the god Enlil was angry with him and that he had to sail away to the Abzu, the realm of Enki, to appease him. He promised them that once he was gone, the land would be blessed with a shower of riches. The people of the city, believing him, eagerly helped him build the great boat. For 7 days, the whole city worked. The craftsmen built the great vessel, and Utnapishtim slaughtered bulls and sheep each day to feed them. He provided them with beer and wine as if it were river water. On the 7th day, the boat was finished. The launch was incredibly difficult, but they managed to get the great cube into the water. Utnapishtim then began to load his possessions, all the gold and silver he had. He loaded his family and his kin, and then, as Enki had instructed, he loaded the seed of all living things. He brought aboard the beasts of the field, both wild and tame, and craftsmen of every kind. He was ready. He waited for the sign from the sun god Shamash. The sign came, and Utnapishtim sealed the single door of the boat, entrusting its navigation to his pilot. The world was about to be washed away. The storm began at dawn. A black cloud rose from the horizon, and from its depths, the thunder god Adad roared. The gods of the storm and the abyss unleashed their full fury. The world was plunged into a terrifying darkness. The storm was so violent, so powerful, that even the gods themselves were frightened. They fled to the highest heaven of Anu, cowering like dogs, huddled against the wall. The goddess Ishtar cried out like a woman in labor, weeping for her beloved humans who were being turned to clay. The gods wept with her, their hearts filled with regret for the destruction they had unleashed. For 6 days and 7 nights, the wind blew, and the floodwaters submerged the land. The storm flattened everything. On the 7th day, the tempest began to subside. Utnapishtim looked out of his small window. He saw a flat, silent expanse of water where the bustling world had once been. All of humanity had been turned back into clay. He fell to his knees and wept. The boat drifted on the endless sea until it came to rest on the peak of Mount Naimush. It remained lodged there for 7 days. On the 7th day, Utnapishtim decided to test the waters. He opened a window and released a dove. The dove flew away, but finding no place to land, it returned to the boat. He then released a swallow. It too returned. Finally, he released a raven. The raven flew away, and seeing that the waters were receding, it found a place to feed. It cawed, and it did not return. Utnapishtim knew then that the earth was emerging from the water. He opened the door of the ark and released all the animals. He then went out onto the mountaintop and made a great sacrifice to the gods. He burned cedar, cane, and myrtle as a sweet-smelling offering. The gods, starved for the sacrifices of humanity, smelled the sweet savor and gathered around the offering like flies. Ishtar was the first to arrive, filled with grief and remorse. But then Enlil, the architect of the flood, arrived. When he saw the boat and the survivors, he was filled with a furious, unreasoning rage. "How did any living thing escape?" he roared. "No man was to survive the destruction." But Enki stepped forward and confronted him. He rebuked Enlil for his thoughtless cruelty. He argued that if a man has sinned, he should be punished, but that total annihilation was unjust. On the sinner lay his sin, he said. On the transgressor lay his transgression. He argued for a more measured form of population control, for lions and wolves to thin out mankind, or for famine and plague, but not for a cataclysm that made no distinction between the innocent and the guilty. Enlil's anger was calmed by Enki's wisdom. He seemed to finally understand the gravity of what he had done. He went aboard the boat, and taking Utnapishtim and his wife by the hand, he blessed them. He declared that, from now on, they would no longer be mortal. They would be like the gods, and they would live forever at the far-off place where the rivers flow out, at the ends of the earth. And that, Utnapishtim concluded, was the story of how he, a mere mortal, had been granted eternal life. It was not a reward for heroism, but a unique, unrepeatable divine gift, a consequence of a cosmic catastrophe. Gilgamesh listened to the old man's story, and a profound despair settled over him. He understood now. Utnapishtim's immortality was a fluke, a one-time event that could never be replicated. There was no secret to be learned, no magic to be performed. His journey had been for nothing. "And what about me?" Gilgamesh asked, his voice heavy with defeat. "I have journeyed all this way. I have suffered so much. Who will convene the assembly of the gods for me, that I might find the life I am looking for?" Utnapishtim looked at the weary king and decided to offer him a challenge, a test to prove if he was truly worthy of conquering his mortal fate. "The one thing that is most like death," he reasoned, "is sleep. Come," he said to Gilgamesh, "prevail against sleep for 6 days and 7 nights." It was a simple test of will. If he could conquer sleep, the image of death, then perhaps he could conquer death itself. But Gilgamesh was utterly exhausted from his long and arduous journey. The moment he sat down, a deep sleep, like a mist, washed over him. Utnapishtim looked at the sleeping king with a mixture of pity and wry amusement. He told his wife to bake a loaf of bread for each day that Gilgamesh slept, and to place it by his head, making a mark on the wall for each day that passed. The bread would be the undeniable proof of his failure. For 7 days, Gilgamesh slept. When Utnapishtim finally woke him, he immediately denied it. "I had hardly slept," he said, "when you touched me and woke me up." But Utnapishtim showed him the loaves of bread. The first was hard and dry, the second was stale, the third was soggy, the fourth was moldy, and the 7th was still fresh on the coals. Gilgamesh was devastated. He could not even conquer sleep. How could he ever hope to conquer death? He had failed the test. His quest was over. He was to be sent back to Uruk, empty-handed. He and the ferryman Urshanabi prepared the boat. But just as he was about to leave, Utnapishtim's wife took pity on the grieving king. She urged her husband to give him something for his journey, a parting gift for all his suffering. Utnapishtim relented. He told Gilgamesh a final secret of the gods. He told him of a magical plant that grew at the bottom of the sea. The plant had a thorn like a rose, and it would prick the hand. But if a man could obtain it, it would restore his lost youth. It was not eternal life, but it was a second chance, a renewal. It was a plant called "The Old Man Becomes a Young Man Again." A new hope, fierce and desperate, flared in Gilgamesh's heart. This was it. Not immortality, but the next best thing. He could live his life over again, a chance to undo his sorrows, a chance to live with the wisdom he had gained. He thanked Utnapishtim and prepared for his final quest. He tied heavy stones to his feet, opened a channel to the deep water, and let himself be pulled down into the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth. He walked on the seabed, the pressure crushing, the darkness almost absolute. And there, he saw it, a plant that glowed with a faint, otherworldly light, its thorns sharp and menacing. He endured the pain, plucked the plant from the seabed, and cut the stones from his feet. He shot back up to the surface, gasping, the precious, thorny plant clutched in his hand. He had done it. He showed the plant to Ur-Shanabi, his voice filled with a triumphant joy he had not felt since the death of his friend. He told the ferryman his plan. He would take the plant back to his city, Uruk. He would not eat it himself, not at first. He would give it to the old men of the city to eat, to test its power. And then, when he himself was old, he would eat it and be restored to his youth, living a cycle of renewal. It was a plan that was, for the first time, not entirely selfish. He wanted to share this gift with his people. He and Ur-Shanabi began their long journey back. They traveled for weeks, their hearts lighter than they had been. One hot afternoon, they stopped to make camp by a cool pool of water. Gilgamesh, seeing the inviting water, decided to bathe. He left the precious plant on the bank of the pool. As he bathed, a serpent, drawn by the sweet, magical fragrance of the plant, slithered out of the water. It seized the plant in its jaws and swallowed it whole. Instantly, the serpent shed its old wrinkled skin, leaving it on the ground, and emerged renewed, young, and vibrant. It then slithered away, back into the pool. Gilgamesh saw it all. He saw the empty skin. He understood what had happened. The one chance he had for a second life had been stolen from him in a moment of carelessness. He sat down on the ground and wept. He wept with a bitterness and a despair that was deeper than anything he had felt before. His quest for fame had led to the death of his friend. His quest for life had ended with a snake stealing his prize. All of his suffering, all of his journeys to the ends of the earth had been for nothing. He had gained nothing for himself. He had only found a treasure for the serpent, the creature that would now embody the very cycle of rebirth and renewal that he had so desperately craved. The return journey to Uruk was a silent one. Gilgamesh's heart was empty. He had no trophies, no secrets of eternal life, no magical plant. He had only his own mortality, now a heavy and undeniable fact. As he and the ferryman Ur-Shanabi approached the great city, Gilgamesh looked up at it, as if seeing it for the first time. He saw the massive, sun-baked brick walls, the culmination of his life's work, the very thing he had tyrannized his people to build. He turned to Ur-Shanabi and spoke, his voice no longer filled with the fire of a hero or the grief of a mourner, but with a quiet, somber sense of acceptance. "Go up, Ur-Shanabi, onto the wall of Uruk, and walk around," he said. "Inspect the foundation platform and scrutinize the brickwork. See if its bricks are not baked brick, and if the 7 sages did not lay its foundations." He pointed out the great districts of the city proper, the orchards, the clay pits, and the precinct of the great temple of Ishtar. He was not boasting of his own strength anymore. He was seeing the city not as his personal monument, but as a great, enduring work, a creation that would outlast him. In that moment, something profound had shifted. He had spent his entire life running from death, seeking a way to make his own, personal existence last forever, first through fame, then through a literal quest for immortality. He had failed at both. But in his failure, he had found a different kind of answer. His immortality would not be in his own life, but in the great city he had built. It would be in the enduring strength of its walls, in the continuation of its culture, in the memory of his people. He had accepted that he, the man, would die. He would turn to clay, just like his friend Enkidu. But Uruk, the great work of human hands, would live on. This was the final, hard-won wisdom of his epic journey. The story ends with Gilgamesh, the great king, back in his city, having finally understood the true nature of his mortal fate. He had learned that the human condition is one of limits, but that meaning can be found not in defying those limits, but in creating something of value within them. He had journeyed to the ends of the earth to find a secret, and the secret, it turned out, was waiting for him right where he had started, in the simple, enduring fact of the city walls, a legacy built to last, a testament to a life lived, however painfully, to its fullest. He had finally found his immortality, not in a magical plant, but in a pile of baked bricks under the Mesopotamian sun. Let's talk about the divine legal system, or the lack thereof, in ancient Mesopotamia. This wasn't a world of clear-cut good and evil, but a cosmos governed by a complex and often contradictory set of rules laid down by a pantheon of gods who were, themselves, not always paragons of virtue. Basically, if you've ever felt that justice is less about objective truth and more about power, jurisdiction, and who you happen to know on the board of directors, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the Mesopotamian concept of divine law. The foundation of all law was the me, the sacred decrees of civilization that Inanna so cleverly stole from a drunk Enki. These were the fundamental principles that governed everything, from kingship and priesthood to warfare and artistry. They were the divine software that made society run. The gods were the guardians of this order, but they were also its biggest violators. The divine court was not a place of impartial justice. It was a family business, and disputes were often settled based on seniority, power, and personal relationships. Anu was the supreme judge, the final court of appeals, but he was often swayed by the passionate arguments of his children. Enlil was the enforcer of the divine order, but his enforcement often looked more like a fit of temper than a reasoned judgment, as in his decision to destroy humanity in the flood. The gods held humanity to a high standard, but they rarely held themselves to the same one. They could be petty, jealous, and vindictive. Ishtar's demand for the bull of heaven to punish Gilgamesh for a personal insult is a prime example. The resulting famine and destruction were, from a human perspective, a gross miscarriage of justice, but from a divine one, it was a goddess's legitimate response to having her honor slighted. For mortals, justice was a reflection of this divine system. The king was the chief judicial officer on earth, his authority granted by the gods, specifically Enlil. The king's laws, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, were seen as being divinely inspired, a mortal attempt to replicate the cosmic order on earth. These laws were often harsh and based on the principle of an eye for an eye. But there was also a deep belief in the importance of protecting the weak. The prologues to these law codes often state that their purpose is to make justice reign in the kingdom, to destroy the wicked and the evil, that the strong may not oppress the weak. But what happened when the gods themselves were the oppressors? For mortals, there was very little recourse. You could pray, you could offer sacrifices, you could try to appease the angry deity. You could also seek the help of a more benevolent god, like Enki, to act as your advocate. But you could not demand justice from the gods. You could only hope for their mercy. The universe was a kingdom, not a republic, and the gods were its absolute and often unpredictable monarchs. Part 27. The Epic of Gilgamesh, while a grand tale of heroism and adventure, is at its core a profound and deeply pessimistic meditation on the human condition, specifically the painful reality of grief. The story is a journey through the stages of grief, not as a neat, linear process, but as a messy, all-consuming, and transformative ordeal. The first half of the story is about the formation of a bond so powerful it redefines the hero's entire existence. Gilgamesh begins as an arrogant, isolated tyrant, his power separating him from his people. The creation of Enkidu, his equal and his opposite, is the creation of his other half. Their friendship is the central, defining relationship of his life. It tames his arrogance, gives him a purpose beyond himself, and for the first time, allows him to experience pure, selfless love. This is the stage of idyllic connection, the before that makes the after so devastating. The death of Enkidu is the inciting incident of the story's second and more profound half. The grief that Gilgamesh experiences is not a quiet sorrow. It is a violent, world-shattering cataclysm. His first reaction is denial. He sits with his friend's body for a week, refusing to accept that he is gone, hoping against hope for a sign of life. This is followed by a raw, animalistic anger and despair. He roars like a lioness. He tears at his clothes and his hair. He rejects his kingship and his civilized life. He is not just mourning his friend. He is mourning the death of a part of himself. This overwhelming grief then transforms into a new, all-consuming emotion: fear. The death of Enkidu is a mirror. In it, Gilgamesh sees his own mortality for the first time. His grief is so unbearable that he cannot fathom experiencing it from the other side. The thought of his own consciousness being extinguished, of becoming nothing but clay, is a terror that eclipses his sorrow. This fear launches him on his great quest for immortality, which is, in essence, a desperate, frantic attempt to outrun his own grief. His journey to the ends of the earth is a flight from the reality of loss. The wisdom he receives from Siduri, to accept his fate and find joy in mortal life, is a call to move towards acceptance. But he is not ready. He cannot accept a world that does not contain Enkidu, and he cannot accept a self that is destined to be erased. The final stage of his grief comes only after he has failed completely. The loss of the magical plant to the serpent is his rock bottom. It is the moment he finally understands that there is no escape. And it is in this moment of utter defeat that he finds a different kind of acceptance. His return to Uruk and his quiet admiration of its walls is a sign that he has finally integrated his grief. He understands that while he and Enkidu are mortal and will turn to dust, the bond they shared and the great things they built together will endure. The story doesn't offer a cure for grief, but it suggests that the only way through it is to embrace the love that caused it and to find a way to build a legacy that honors that love. A legacy that can, in its own way, outlive death itself. The relationship between humanity and the gods in Mesopotamia was not one of gentle, paternalistic love. It was a relationship of servitude, of fear, and of a constant, wearying effort to keep the divine powers from becoming angry. It was, in many ways, the relationship of a peasant farmer to a powerful, unpredictable, and often absentee landlord. According to the myths, humanity was not created out of love or as a beautiful reflection of the divine. Humanity was created for a very practical reason. The younger gods were tired of doing all the work. The myth of Atrahasis tells us that the junior gods had to dig the great rivers and canals, a form of back-breaking divine labor. They eventually went on strike, burning their tools and surrounding the house of the chief god, Enlil. To solve this labor dispute, the wise god Enki proposed a solution: create a new, lesser being to do the work for them. And so, humanity was created from clay, mixed with the blood and intelligence of a slaughtered god, to be the slaves of the gods. Their entire purpose was to serve, to provide the gods with food and drink through sacrifice, to build their temples, and to maintain the order of the world so the gods would not be bothered. This is a fundamentally pessimistic view of the human condition. Life was not a gift. It was a sentence of hard labor. And the gods were not benevolent caretakers. They were demanding taskmasters. They were powerful and immortal, but they were also beset by very human-like flaws. They were prone to fits of jealousy, anger, and pettiness. They could be lazy, capricious, and shockingly cruel. Enlil's decision to destroy humanity in the flood because they were making too much noise is the ultimate example of this. It's the act of a being with absolute power and absolutely no sense of proportion or empathy. Mortals lived in a state of constant anxiety. The world was filled with omens. In the sky, in the entrails of sacrificed animals, in the patterns of oil on water, that had to be constantly interpreted to try and divine the mood of the gods. A drought, a flood, a plague, a military defeat, all were seen as signs of divine anger. The primary goal of religious life was to appease these powerful, unpredictable beings. This was done through a complex system of rituals and sacrifices. The temples were not just places of worship. They were the literal houses of the gods on earth, and the priests and priestesses were their household servants. The smoke from the sacrificial altar was the food that fed the gods and kept them happy. Life was a constant, precarious negotiation with a set of powerful, immortal, and emotionally unstable overlords. The best you could hope for was to be ignored. At the end of his long and sorrowful journey, Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, a changed man. The wild, arrogant king who left in a storm of grief has been weathered and humbled by his travels, his failures, and his final, stark acceptance of his mortal fate. The conclusion of the epic is not a grand, heroic victory, but a quiet, profound moment of wisdom. The story does not end with Gilgamesh finding a way to cheat death. It ends with him embracing his humanity. The true immortality he finds is not personal, but communal. It is the legacy he will leave behind in his great city. This shift in perspective is the ultimate resolution of his character arc. He began the story as a tyrant who used his people as tools to build his monuments. He ends it as a true king who understands that the monument itself is the thing of value, a creation that will shelter and define his people long after he is gone. But there is a final, poignant addition to the epic, a later tablet that serves as a sort of appendix. In this story, Enkidu is still alive, and he volunteers to go down to the underworld to retrieve some of Gilgamesh's lost possessions. Gilgamesh gives him a long list of warnings about how to behave in the land of the dead to avoid being trapped there. Do not wear clean clothes. Do not anoint yourself with fine oil. Do not carry a weapon. But Enkidu, in his carelessness, does all of these things and is immediately seized by the underworld. Gilgamesh is heartbroken and prays to the gods to allow his friend to return. The god Enki, in his wisdom, arranges for a hole to be opened in the earth, and the spirit of Enkidu emerges to speak with his friend one last time. Gilgamesh, desperate for knowledge, asks him to describe the world of the dead. Enkidu is hesitant, saying that if he told him, he would sit down and weep. But Gilgamesh presses him, and Enkidu paints a bleak picture. He describes the decay of the body, the misery of the forgotten souls whose relatives make no offerings, and the grim, dusty reality of the house of dust. It is a final, crushing confirmation of everything Gilgamesh feared, but it also serves to reinforce the wisdom he has already gained. If the afterlife is a place of such misery and decay, then the life on this earth, with its loves, its friendships, its achievements, and its sorrows, is all the more precious. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its final form, leaves us with a powerful and enduring message. It is a story that confronts the deepest of human fears, the fear of death and oblivion, and finds the answer not in a magical plant or a divine gift, but in the very fabric of human civilization, in friendship, in legacy, and in the courage to live a full and meaningful life in the face of our own inescapable end.